Welcome to part two of my discussion with Philip Haslam, economic advisor and author of When Money Destroys Nations. Click the subscribe button below for more RTD interviews as well as monetary news to come. Enjoy.
Um, in chapter 5 of our book, we talk about the detailed economic processes, a very accessible language of, as money printing begins to accelerate, it has some key effects. One of them being that stores begin to empty. It places pressure on suppliers of goods and services, as it was in Zimbabwe. And obviously, if you're hearing this, you're thinking, oh, well, that's interesting. That must have huge social implications. So in the one sense, hyperinflation is an economic process where money printing leads to prices rising very rapidly. And yet, at the same time, it's very much related to individual people living out their lives and how it affects people on the ground.
Right. Understandable. That's a very simple form of understanding it. Now, let's go into Zimbabwe. When you were there and you were scrabbling in your notepad, getting some of these stories, what's one or two of the stories that really just touched your heart the most, to where it just really made you appreciate, where you're at and, the rest of the world for the most part, because you felt so connected with that person's story?
Well, I'd love to give two stories, or one story of someone I interviewed, and then I'll give my own story of when I was in Zim. So the first story was of a father who was he was a CEO of a large company, and his wife did all of the shopping and all of the sourcing of food. Now, you can imagine that when the stores ran out, it became quite a dilemma in the cities, because people didn't have any access to food apart from the stores. And so what actually happened in Zimbabwe was a barter network developed in those cities, where people would say, okay, well, look, I've got some wood and you've got some milk, and he's got grain and that other person's got fuel, and together we then start to barter, and it became a relational network to the extent where those who had relationships survived, and those who didn't have relationships, well, they didn't survive. Okay, and relationships became the form of currency and the strength that you actually had, that relational network. So in this particular instance, the husband and wife, the wife had been sourcing all of the food through her relational network, and she had to suddenly leave because her mother had fallen ill, and she said, look, just look after the kids for two weeks, and I'll be back in 2 weeks. So she left, and this guy was clueless, didn't know who to get any food from, and they had two teenage sons and a daughter, and the son, they ate everything in the house fairly quickly, and then he went and drove around the city center. He couldn't find any stores that had any food. So eventually managed to source through one of his friends a large kilogram, I'm not sure sort of how much it weighed, but he sort of indicated it was about this large, of cheese. Mm. And so they lived on cheese for a couple of days. And eventually, he just woke up one morning and he said, look, in my company, I can source fuel. So he got fuel and he drove all the way to the South African border. At the South African border, he then, with his kids, went, and the first thing they did was they got takeout. They ate takeout. And then they went and did a big shop at the South African border. And it's illustrative of the stresses that an individual family would go through when you are so used to your supply chains bringing you your goods and services, and those supply chains being shut down. The other story that I wanted to share was one of my friends said I could stay with him with his family in Harare, which is the capital city of Zimbabwe, and I went through. In this instance, I took a bus through, and I'd spent the 24 hours on the bus, so I was a bit grimy and everything. And I got to the bus station in Harare, and my friend's brother picked me up, and the first thing I said to him was, "Look, gosh, I can't wait to have a shower." can't wait to clean myself off.
Hmm.
That bus was a grimy trip,
Yeah.
And eventually he drove us to his house. And I mentioned a few times in the car, Flip, I'm really looking forward to that shower. And got to his house, and he had a domestic helper who came through to me, and she said, "Look, you can have a bath."
Hmm.
Now, I mean, perhaps I was being a bit naive and ignorant. I said, "Look, I'm actually not the bathing type. It's okay. I'll have a shower." Okay.
Hmm.
I didn't realize. And I went through to the back, and to my shame, it turns out that they didn't have any water.
Mm.
And so what they had to do was store barrels of water in their kitchen all the way along their passageway and in their bathroom. And the domestic helper had taken a tub of water and heated it over a stove using a generator to heat to get electricity, and the generator was using fuel because there was no electricity. It was a country, Zimbabwe, Harare was an area that had electricity, and yet during hyperinflation, all of that stuff shut down.
Wow.
And during that experience, that was quite a real experience for me, because I'd been interviewing a whole lot of people, but I hadn't experienced the pressures of hyperinflation for myself. So I'm used to having a shower every day and cleaning myself off, and here I had to had this sort of tiny little tub of water that was lukewarm, and sort of wiping myself down with a sort of face cloth became very real to me.
Mm-hmm.
Money printing, economics, the macroeconomic terms became real to me in a very personal way.
Right.
So hopefully those are two stories that are illustrative to highlight what actually happens in a money printing and hyperinflation world.
Right. It does, big time for me, because it puts me in a situation where I'm trying to imagine, coming home, no electricity, no running water, and, having a guest over and saying, "Hey, man, this is the best I can offer you because of what's going on." And, at that time, not sure if you were fully aware of what was happening global. I mean, as far as the whole country, but just to be brought into that situation there could be shocking. So nevertheless, the entire country. But so at this point now, what's the viewpoint of the Zimbabwean dollar? I mean, I'm assuming they began rethinking the Zimbabwean dollar a long time ago. But where do they stand now as far as their currency? I know that they use other currencies, but is the Zimbabwe dollar still in function?
So the Zimbabwe dollar is completely out of circulation. So very early on in the inflation process, people began to realize, hang on a second, it's not worth my while receiving newly printed money for goods and services that I give using my hard labor. So they began to move away from Zimbabwe dollars. And you see, this is the interesting thing about money printing, is that as a government begins to print money, it has to increasingly control the population to use that money, because they're saying, well, hang on a second, no, I mean, give me something of real value. Don't just print money and give it to me. And so you get this sort of thing in all hyperinflations, where you get increased money printing and increased control by the government to make sure that people use it. Mm-hmm. So for the last several years in Zimbabwe, the currency was only in use because of legal tender laws that the government put in place. So you couldn't trade in alternative currencies. You had to use Zimbabwe money. And in fact, you didn't. It wasn't only Zimbabwe dollars that you had to use. You had to use banked Zimbabwe dollars, so that the government could trace your transactions. It could monitor that your prices were not being increased too far, and all of those things. So if people paid with large sums of cash, obviously if they paid in foreign currency, they got put in jail.
Really?
Well, obviously, but this is something that sort of became obvious to people.
Right.
But as hyperinflation began to become entrenched in Zimbabwe, even paying large amounts of Zimbabwe dollars actually became a criminal offense, which was penalizable with a jail offense, a jail term rather.
Huh? I'm sorry to cut you off. So they would force you to use it. And if you chose to give them large amounts of it back for transactions, you would be jailed for it?
Correct. Yes. No. Well, if you brought it to the bank, then they would be fine with that.
Mm-hmm.
But if you were trying to trade with other people for ordinary transactions, then you could be put in jail for that. I think important to kind of note that what happens as a government prints money, the money begins to depreciate, it loses its value. And if you have money that's losing its value, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to go out into the market and try to find and buy something that actually retains its value. So in a money printing environment, you typically get this huge frenzy, what we call scorched money. Money becomes scorched. People just trying to get rid of it. It's not something they want to hold, and you get this frenzy. But unfortunately, it's a frenzy. It's a consumption frenzy where everything in the economy begins to get consumed, and nothing is produced.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when the currency is about to die its death. But the government then wants to control that process. So everyone tries to get that money. They try to go to the bank and withdraw their money, and so they say no. You actually have to keep the money in the banks.
Mm. Wow. Now, as we draw towards the end of our discussion here, I want to get in towards the back of your book, part 3 of your book. The global storm brewing. You start off by talking about the dollar supremacy. What's that chapter all about, and how does it tie into the global picture of that and everything like that from your initial State of the Economy address?
Yeah, so we deal specifically with how does the US dollar specifically, how did the US dollar become the global reserve currency? And we look at the history of it from 1944 after the World War II, where what was known as the Bretton Woods system was established, where everyone in the world began to trade in US dollars, and that those US dollars got a gold backing, had a gold backing. So effectively, those US dollars were claims against gold that you could redeem at the Federal Reserve. So anyway, we look at from that moment all the way through and how that deteriorated to what we have today, and we have a system known as the petrodollar system, where if anyone wants to get oil, they have to first purchase US dollars, and it entrenched the US dollar as the global reserve currency. And I guess sort of our readers can go and read those chapters and get further understanding of how that works.
Right, understandable. Now, chapter 13, get prepared. We know the problem. I know you explained the problem that happened in Zimbabwe quite well to where I can actually, somewhat feel it myself. Now, what's the solutions? What are some of the solutions that the Zimbabweans took for themselves and for this global, storm brewing? What are some solutions for what you foresee coming? What exactly do you foresee coming?
So you asked a few questions.
Oh, I'm sorry. So first one, there's a lot of stuff going on. The global, storm is brewing.
Yeah.
What's the solution for individual family, for the CEO, for the farmer, for the the Wendy's, McDonald's worker here type of person, for what's going on globally?
So that's an excellent question, and it's a very hard one to answer. I'll tell you why. Is that everywhere I go, I have people say to me, Okay, I get it. There might be a risk of hyperinflation in many of the developed countries around the world. Tell me, what must I do? Just come on, give me the sort of top 5 things I need to do. Let's just summarize it quickly. Because people like passive investments.
Mm-hmm.
They like to be able to transfer their money, and their money is working for them in the background. And yet, the reality is, in a money printing world, passive investments don't work. You can't get passive investments. The pensioners who save their money in various pension funds. In fact, almost all investments that pensioners have invested in during hyperinflation were wiped out to practically zero.
Mm.
And because passive investments don't work, and we talk about that in the book.
Right.
So it's not an easy question, because it becomes now, well, how do I respond to this scenario with an active investment strategy? Okay, so I'll give an example. If you knew that fuel was going to rise in double in price in the next week, what would you do?
Oh, go
What
buy
would you
another
do
fuel.
if fuel was going to double in price next week, and the week after that, and the week after that, and the week after that?
Try to get as much as I can.
You
Today.
try to get as much as you can. And then what would happen once you finished your fuel? You'd need to get some more, and then, it would put pressure on fuel lines. What would you do if the stores were empty?
Mm.
On and on and on. So, practically there are many business opportunities. So we when we look at it, we're advising people, we talk about splitting it into risk and opportunity. Now, if money printing is it's happening in your country, it is a very real risk to you. And the best way that you can look to hedge those risks, apart from things like buying hard assets, getting yourself in getting proper land, getting appropriate community in place. These are sort of some of the things that are sort of at the top of the head, but you can get to further detail in the book. But the best way that you can deal with hedging risk is to educate yourself. Because the reality is that those who understand will know how to respond. There's no quick solution. You actually have to be able to apply your mind to your own particular circumstances, and then how that would how inflation and hyperinflation would affect you, for you to be able to respond. The next thing is obviously the opportunities. Now, the markets change significantly in a hyperinflation scenario. Right? If there's no electricity in your city, what are the opportunities? Again, that comes around. It comes to understanding how society changes, and then looking for opportunities. Specifically, though, is providing alternative currencies. Now, there's many different things that Zimbabweans did, which you can sort of read up about, and they're very innovative. But if you can provide alternatives to people to store value, to trade, and to facilitate loan and investment transactions, you'll do very well in hyperinflation. Just a note, though, that one of the persons that I interviewed, her father knew that hyperinflation was coming. He knew that the government was printing money, and he went to South America to study the hyperinflations there. He came back and he did very well for himself, because he had taken the time to educate himself and to learn how to respond appropriately and strategically.
Well, this concludes my discussion with Philip Haslam. Hope you found this conversation to be very informative. I want to encourage you to get a copy of his book, When Money Destroys Nations. Scroll down below, click the RTD Bookstore tab where you can get a copy of his book there. Also, leave us a comment. I would love to hear your thoughts on this interview as well as your take. If you have an Android, visit the Google Play Store where you can download the RTD app. Look forward to giving you more interviews in the future. See you later.